It really makes you think, when we talk about being good, is
Yeah.
there like one right way? Or does it depend on who you are and where you are on your journey? Like, it's a question philosophers have been grappling with forever.
It really is.
And it's exactly what we're going to dive into today.
Mm.
How Buddhist ethics, this ancient tradition, tackles these big questions.
Yeah, and you've brought a really fascinating resource for this deep dive, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, get this, ethics in Indian Buddhism. It's a mouthful. But I think our goal today should be to really unpack the core insights from this entry, especially thinking about your background in philosophy.
Totally. I mean, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is just this incredible resource,
Yeah.
so rigorous, so comprehensive. It covers like everything from the basic teachings to the really complex theoretical structures, even contemporary issues. It's a lot.
It's huge. But that's kind of our mission today, right? To go through all of that, find the key ethical frameworks, the concepts, the debates, and then present them in a way that's clear, engaging, but also, speaks to the philosophical mind, maybe even uncover some surprising facts and have some aha moments along the way.
I'm here for it. I think whether you're already into ethical theory or just curious about different ways to live a good life, we're going to try to guide you through the most interesting and thought-provoking parts of Buddhist ethics. So, where do we even begin with unpacking all of this for someone who loves philosophy? What's the basic idea here?
Well, the heart of Buddhist practice, the core of Buddhist ethics, is this idea of achieving liberation from suffering.
Okay.
But it's not just avoiding pain in a simple way. It's about a fundamental shift in how we understand reality, letting go of all the distorted ways we interpret the world. Ethical action is right at the center of that, both as a way to get there and what happens when you do.
So it's not just about rules then.
Not exactly. It is crucial to stop doing harmful things, not just because they obviously cause suffering for others, but also because they mess up our own minds, make it hard to see clearly. But here's where it gets interesting for a philosopher. Ethical action isn't just a tool to reach liberation. It's seen as something that naturally comes out of reaching that understanding. Someone who really gets the nature of reality, who's gone beyond suffering, they just act with loving kindness and compassion towards everyone. They want everyone to be free and happy.
I like that. Ethics as a side effect of wisdom. The entry mentioned there's not a direct equivalent for ethics in Buddhist language, which raises some interesting philosophical questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. The closest we get is the word yila, which is often translated as moral discipline, but it's more about this committed practice, the cultivated disposition to uphold these moral principles. And what's really interesting, especially for philosophers, is that there aren't direct equivalents for some fundamental Western ethical concepts. Like, it's not clear if there's a Buddhist idea that perfectly matches our concept of moral obligation, in the Kantian sense.
Oh, categorical imperative then.
Not exactly. And when they talk about value, they do touch on intrinsic versus instrumental value, but without using those specific terms. It's more about observing how a wise person acts and inferring the ethical principles from there, rather than starting with abstract rules.
Right. So it's like a wise person doesn't lie. Could be a rule or just a description. That ambiguity is fascinating from a philosophical point of view.
Exactly. But this doesn't mean there's no ethical content. They do use words like kushala and shubha, which mean good, skillful, beautiful in a very specific way. They tell us what we should do. They give us these examples of altruistic behavior that we should admire and try to follow. Even without a word for ethics, they've got this whole system of moral discipline. It's definitely there.
Okay, so even without a perfect translation, they've got a solid ethical framework. And a big motivator for following these guidelines seems to be karma and rebirth. For those of us used to secular ethics, how are those concepts presented and why are they important ethically?
This is where things can get tricky. The traditional idea of karmic consequences and rebirth in the six realms, that's a huge part of Buddhist ethics, historically speaking. You've got these realms from the hell realms where there's nothing but suffering to the heavens where the gods live, blissful but temporary. And then you've got the hungry ghosts, the animals, the humans, and the titans. All these different outcomes based on your actions.
Yeah, those descriptions, the hell realms, the hungry ghosts, it's all pretty intense.
Very intense. And they were often taken literally as real places. Actions driven by greed, hatred, and delusion were thought to lead to rebirth in those lower realms, full of suffering. And actions driven by more wholesome motivations, even if they're still tied to the idea of a self, could lead to rebirth in the higher realms.
And the human realm, that's where it gets interesting, right?
Exactly. The human realm is special. It's the only one where you can actually achieve awakening and escape the whole cycle of rebirth. This is why moral discipline is so important. You've got the 5 precepts for lay people: no killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, or intoxication. And then you've got even stricter vows for monks and nuns. All of this is about avoiding bad karma, staying out of those lower realms, and cultivating a clear mind and self-respect, which you need for spiritual progress. From a philosophical perspective, it's like a system of motivational psychology, all tied up with this cosmology.
A system where ethics have long-term consequences, even across lifetimes.
Yeah.
So we've got these general precepts.
Yeah.
Then we have the 10 good courses of action. How do they fit in?
The 10 good courses of action are basically the flip side of the 10 bad courses of action. So instead of saying what you should do, they focus on what you shouldn't do. Things like taking life, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, idle chit-chat, covetousness, malice, and wrong view. Avoiding all of these is seen as inherently good, karmically speaking.
Right, there's overlap with the 5 precepts, except for the mental actions.
You got it. The first 4 bad actions pretty much line up with the first 4 precepts. Now, intoxication isn't explicitly listed in the 10 bad courses, maybe because while it can definitely lead to bad things, just getting intoxicated itself doesn't directly hurt someone else. But it makes it way more likely you will hurt someone, so it's breaking the spirit of ethical conduct. And what's interesting philosophically is how they categorize these bad actions. 3 are physical, 4 are verbal, and then the last 3, covetousness, malice, and wrong view, are all mental states. This shows how ethics in Buddhism goes beyond just outward behavior. It's about your thoughts and intentions too.
And those mental states tie directly into the 3 poisons: attraction, aversion, and ignorance. Those are central to Buddhist philosophy.
Absolutely. Covetousness comes from attraction or craving, malice from aversion or hatred, and wrong view is basically ignorance, not understanding reality. Overcoming these 3 poisons is how you get liberated, and being ethical is both part of that process and something that results from it. You work on ethical discipline, it weakens those poisons.
Okay, so we've got the foundation of Buddhist ethics. But as the entry mentions, Buddhism isn't just one thing. There's Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana. They each have their own ideas. How do their ethical approaches differ, especially for someone looking at them through a philosophical lens?
Well, the 3 main surviving traditions, they do have different emphases, ethically speaking, but there's a lot of common ground too. Theravada, which is big in Southeast Asia, it's traditionally about becoming an arhat. That's a fully liberating being who reaches nirvana at the end of their life, no more rebirth. Now, becoming a Buddha is possible in Theravada, but most practitioners focus on their own liberation through ethical discipline, mental cultivation, and wisdom.
Mahayana, on the other hand, which is dominant in East Asia, they have a different goal, right? How does that affect their ethics?
The core of Mahayana is the bodhisattva ideal. Practitioners vow not just to liberate themselves, but to become Buddhas, to liberate all beings from suffering. It's a huge commitment. They're willing to stay in the cycle of existence lifetime after lifetime until everyone's enlightened. And then you have Vajrayana, practiced in the Himalayas and parts of Central Asia. They share that Mahayana goal of universal Buddhahood, but they use these specific tantric practices, visualizations, rituals. That adds another layer to the ethics, especially when it comes to intention and skillful means.
The term Hinayana came up in the entry, described as a pejorative term. For someone interested in the history of philosophical ideas, what's the story there?
So Hinayana means lesser vehicle. It was used by Mahayana texts to refer to non-Mahayana traditions, usually those focused on the arhat ideal. Today, scholars prefer Sravakayama, the vehicle of the disciples, or way of the hearers, which is more accurate and less judgmental. The thing is, Mahayana texts often criticize these earlier traditions. They'd say focusing on individual liberation showed a lack of universal compassion, and that the arhat path was less profound, less complete than the bodhisattva path. Philosophically, this is about 2 different ideals: individual versus universal liberation, and a debate about which path is more effective, more morally praiseworthy.
But the entry argues that the Mahayana criticisms might not be entirely fair, right? Especially when it comes to Theravada ethics.
Yeah, there's nuance. Cultivating the 4 divine abidings: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. That's central to most Buddhist traditions, including Theravada. And it's not just about feeling these things passively, it's about actively cultivating them, directing them towards all beings. Loving kindness is wishing everyone happiness. Compassion is wanting them to be free from suffering. Empathetic joy is being happy for others without envy. And equanimity is seeing all beings impartially, no attachment or aversion. The Metta Sutta, which is fundamental in Theravada, it really shows that deep ethical commitment to universal loving kindness. So the Mahayana critique about lacking compassion, well, it's complicated. Many scholars don't agree with it.
Right. So it's not so black and white.
Right.
Back to Mahayana and Vajrayana with their
Mm.
bodhisattva ideal. They talk about the six perfections. For someone studying virtue ethics, how do these compare to Western ideas of virtue?
The six perfections, or paramitas, they're the core practices of a bodhisattva. It's about developing these transcendent virtues. You've got generosity, ethical conduct, patient endurance, energetic perseverance, meditative concentration, and wisdom. There are definitely parallels with Western virtue ethics in the sense of developing good character traits, but the Buddhist perfections are all about reaching Buddhahood for everyone and are often understood in the context of emptiness.
Patient endurance, Kanti, seems like a particularly interesting one. Like it's more than just stoicism.
Absolutely. Kanti is about bearing hardship without resentment. It's about staying calm when people hurt you. And maybe most importantly, it's about having the courage to accept the deepest truths of reality, even when they're challenging. That last part connects it to wisdom.
And what makes them transcendent? What makes them different from just being a good person?
They're transcendent because they're practiced with the wisdom of emptiness. You don't get attached to the act, the actor, or the recipient. They call this threefold purity. So take generosity. A bodhisattva, ideally, they give without clinging to the idea of a self who's giving, a receiver who's getting, or the gift itself as something inherently real. It's all empty. And understanding that emptiness, it transforms generosity. It's not ego boosting anymore. It's liberating, both for the giver and ultimately for everyone. This whole idea of emptiness being the foundation for ethical action, it's a really unique philosophical angle to Buddhist virtue ethics.
Yeah, emptiness is part of ethical perfection. That's definitely different from a lot of Western ethical theories.
Mm.
Now, the entry says that while Buddhist texts often focus on specific rules and virtues, there are places where they give reasons for things, and consequentialism seems to be one of them. Philosophically, how well does consequentialism explain Buddhist ethics?
Good point. It's true that the focus often seems to be on developing a good character and following ethical rules. But there are definitely passages that sound consequentialist. Like they judge actions based on their outcomes, especially in terms of happiness and suffering. The advice to Rahula at Ambalathika is a good example. It says you should think about whether an action, whether it's something you do, say, or think, is likely to lead to harm or suffering. If it is, avoid it. If it leads to benefit and happiness, it's ethically sound. That focus on the consequences for well-being, that's classic consequentialism.
And then you have Shanadeva, right?
Yeah.
He seems to really lay out a consequentialist view, especially within Mahayana.
Oh, absolutely. Shanadeva's training anthology, it's got some of the most explicit, consequentialist-sounding passages in Buddhist literature. There's this one verse where he basically says, a bodhisattva should work tirelessly to alleviate all suffering, present and future, and bring about all happiness, present and future, for all beings. Whatever it takes, even accepting minor discomforts to stop bigger harms, or sacrificing smaller benefits for bigger ones. It sounds a lot like classic utilitarianism universalist, maximizing, maybe even hedonistic. It's all about the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Hedonistic in the philosophical sense of pleasure and the absence of pain being the ultimate good.
Exactly. But scholars do debate whether Shantideva was a true utilitarian in the Western sense. And even if he was, it doesn't mean all of Buddhist ethics is strictly consequentialist. But it definitely shows that consequentialism has a place in Mahayana thought.
The ownerless suffering argument, which comes from the doctrine of no self, also seems to justify altruism in a way that aligns with consequentialism. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure, so the ownerless suffering argument uses the Buddhist idea of anatta, or not man, the idea that there's no permanent independent self. If there's no me in the ultimate sense, then the difference between my suffering and your suffering, it becomes less important. Suffering is just suffering, something to be stopped wherever it is. From this perspective, putting your own well-being above others, it doesn't make sense philosophically. It leads to altruism, being concerned for everyone's suffering. That really resonates with consequentialist ethics. It's a good example of how a core Buddhist idea about the nature of reality has huge ethical implications.
But then the entry also talks about the importance of intention in Buddhist ethics, which seems to move away from a purely outcome-based view. How does intention fit into all of this?
That's a key point. Intention is everywhere in Buddhist ethics. You've got the story of Channa accidentally giving the Buddha bad food but being praised for his good intentions. He wanted to offer nourishment. Even though it caused harm, his pure motivation canceled out the negative karma. It's the same with any action. The intention behind it determines how heavy it is karmically. An action motivated by hatred is much worse than the same action motivated by greed. Some teachings even say that a good intention basically makes an action good, regardless of the outcome. This focus on the inner state, on the person doing the action, it definitely challenges a purely consequentialist view.
And how does this emphasis on intention affect the principle of nonviolence, especially in situations where violence might lead to a better outcome?
This is where it gets really complex. Nonviolence, not harming, that's fundamental to Buddhism. But intention provides a different perspective. The Mahayana tradition, for instance, talks about situations where a bodhisattva, out of compassion, might break certain rules if it means significantly reducing suffering. In those cases, the intention becomes the most important thing in judging whether the action is ethical or not. It doesn't overturn the general principle of nonviolence, but it adds a layer of understanding based on motivation.
What about virtue ethics? The entry suggests that Buddhist ethics can be seen through that lens too, connecting it to thinkers like Aristotle.
Yeah, Damien Kuhn has made a strong case for a virtue ethics interpretation. He links Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia flourishing, living well, with the Buddhist idea of nirvana, especially in Theravada. So the virtues you cultivate on the path, like the six perfections in Mahayana, they're valuable because they either help you reach nirvana or are part of what it means to be awakened. Ethical conduct isn't about following rules or maximizing good outcomes. It's about developing a virtuous character. You become the kind of person who naturally acts ethically.
So it's less about what should I do and more about what kind of person should I be.
Right. But even then, there's debate about the ultimate goal. Is it personal awakening, like in classical virtue ethics? Or is it about everyone's well-being and liberation, which makes it more outward-focused? Interestingly, the Buddhist view of karma says that helping others ultimately benefits you too. So maybe self-interest and altruism aren't so separate after all. That might be different from some Western virtue ethics. Also, the entry points out that virtue ethics seems to fit better with Theravada, with its emphasis on character development. Kuhn himself sees Mahayana ethics as more consequentialist.
So Buddhist ethics doesn't neatly fit into our Western categories. The entry mentions some hybrid approaches that try to bridge these different ideas.
Yeah, there are theories like character consequentialism. It basically says we should maximize well-being, but well-being includes both happiness and being virtuous. So virtues are good in themselves and also because they lead to good outcomes. Then there's archaic consequentialism, which focuses on developing the character traits that are most likely to make everyone happy and flourish. These hybrid theories try to take the best of both worlds, combining virtue ethics and consequentialism to understand Buddhist ethics.
So how do they define well-being in Buddhist ethics?
Yeah.
It's clearly more than just pleasure.
Well, the entry mentions terms like artha and hita, which suggest a concept of well-being. Ultimately, in Buddhism, well-being is about being free from suffering, escaping the cycle of rebirth. But on a more everyday level, it probably includes things like mental peace, getting rid of negative emotions, having good relationships, and living ethically. Buddhism isn't big on craving and attachment, so it's unlikely to say that well-being is just about getting what you want. Some scholars talk about a homeostatic cluster view, where well-being comes from the balance of all the Buddhist virtues. They've even discussed nature fulfillment theories, though the idea of no self creates problems for that, at least on an ultimate level.
It's a lot to think about. Now, this idea of normative gradualism, that seems like a really unique idea. Can you explain it a bit more?
Yeah, normative gradualism. It's a theory by Javier Hidalgo, and it's fascinating. He says our ethical duties, even the reasons why we act ethically, can change as we progress on the Buddhist path. So, someone just starting out might focus on ethical behavior for reasons that are tied to their sense of self, which is ultimately an illusion, like they want to avoid bad karma or develop good qualities. But as they understand Anatman better and realize how interconnected everything is, their ethical reasoning might become more consequentialist. They see the importance of relieving suffering for everyone without thinking about their own self-interest.
So as you grow spiritually, your ethical reasoning gets more refined, more universal.
Exactly. It suggests that ethics in Buddhism isn't static. It changes as you develop. You might start with a more rule-based approach or focus on virtue, but then move towards a deeper consequentialism based on realizing there's no self. It's a way to explain the different ethical ideas you find in Buddhist teachings at different levels of practice.
And the entry says that Buddhist ethics might be pluralistic and particularistic, meaning it doesn't fit into one neat theory. What does that mean?
So pluralism means that it draws on a bunch of different moral ideas. Consequentialism, deontology, because of the precepts, virtue ethics, without strictly sticking to any one of them. And particularism takes it a step further. It suggests that Buddhist ethics might reject universal moral principles altogether. Instead, it emphasizes making ethical decisions based on wisdom and compassion in each specific situation. It explains why there's so much diversity in how Buddhist texts talk about ethics, but some might say it lacks a clear system for resolving conflicts.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about metacethics. For philosophers interested in moral truth and justification, what does Buddhism have to say, even if it's not a central focus?
It's true that Buddhist texts don't go deep into metaethics like Western philosophy does, but contemporary scholars have offered interpretations. Jake Davis, for instance, suggests that ethical norms in Buddhism come from what enlightened beings, those who have calm, clear, wise minds, would approve or disapprove of. This fits with the emphasis on the wisdom of the Buddha and other awakened figures as guides for ethical behavior. Jonathan Gold has a more relativistic metaethical view based on emptiness. He says that ethics in Buddhism is basically a tool for reducing suffering. It's practical, psychological, and belongs to the realm of conventional truth, not ultimate reality. But he argues this doesn't lead to nihilism because even within this relativistic framework, actions and views that cause suffering become unsustainable for someone who understands emptiness. So the validity of ethics is tied to its effectiveness in reaching liberation.
That's a fascinating overview of the theoretical side. But then you have these statements in Buddhist texts saying moral discipline might become unnecessary at very advanced stages of spiritual development. That sounds paradoxical. How do we make sense of that?
Those are some of the most intriguing and often misunderstood parts of Buddhist ethics. In the Pali Canon, for example, there are statements saying that arhats have abandoned goodness and vile actions. One way to understand this, as Damien Kuhn suggests, is that goodness and vile actions refer to actions that create karma leading to rebirth. An arhat has eliminated the roots of rebirth, which are attachment and aversion fueled by the illusion of self. So their actions, even if they look good or bad to us, don't create future karma anymore. It's not that they can do whatever they want without consequences, it's that they've let go of the belief in a solid self, and that's what drives karma.
So they're not off the hook entirely.
Not in terms of rebirth, no. But there's this seeming contradiction in some Theravada texts. They say saints naturally act ethically in harmony with the Dharma, but they would never break monastic rules, even seemingly arbitrary ones like not eating after noon. It makes you wonder about what motivates ethical action. Do those who have inner freedom still need external rules? If their actions are spontaneous and come from wisdom and compassion, why would they always stick to these rules?
Yeah, it's like inner realization versus outer behavior. How does Mahayana deal with this?
Mahayana thinkers, like Asanga and Shantideva, they really emphasize compassion. They say that a bodhisattva at an advanced level, driven by this desire to relieve suffering and make everyone happy, they might actually break certain ethical rules if it means achieving that goal. The key is their motivation. It has to be pure compassion.
And they give some pretty radical examples, right? Like lying to prevent harm, or even using violence in extreme situations.
Yeah, Asanga talks about scenarios where a bodhisattva might lie, use divisive speech, overthrow bad leaders, steal back monastic property from thieves, or even kill a bandit to prevent them from harming others and to stop them from creating more negative karma. The idea is that the compassionate goal to minimize suffering and maximize well-being for everyone, including the person doing the harm, can sometimes override the rules.
That brings up some big ethical dilemmas, like the classic "would you kill Hitler" scenario. How would this Mahayana framework approach that?
It could be seen as permissible, but only if it was purely out of compassion for everyone who would suffer under Hitler, and even compassion for Hitler himself because of the negative karma he was creating. But it has to be totally free of hatred or personal dislike. It's like a doctor performing a painful surgery or a parent restraining a loved one who's temporarily out of control. The force they use is out of care to prevent something worse.
So it's like a consequentialism, but with compassion as the driving force.
Exactly. Both Asanga and Shantideva say that breaking the rules is okay if it leads to more good and comes from genuine compassion. And in Vajrayana, you sometimes see even more radical examples, revered masters doing things that seem shocking, but their followers understand it as deep compassion, a freedom from limitations to ultimately benefit others.
It definitely challenges our usual ideas about ethics.
Hmm.
Now, what about animals and the environment? What are the ethical considerations there?
Buddhist ethics cares about all sentient beings, and that includes animals. They see everything as interconnected through rebirth. So any animal you meet could have been a family member or friend in a past life. That creates empathy and a sense of responsibility. Human life is generally seen as more valuable because we have a better chance of awakening, but there's still this strong ethical duty not to harm animals unnecessarily.
So vegetarianism would be the logical ethical choice, right?
A lot of Buddhists do choose to be vegetarian, but it's not a requirement in all traditions. Theravada monks, for example, traditionally accept food offered to them, including meat, as long as they don't think the animal was killed specifically for them. But personally, killing animals and jobs like hunting and fishing, those are considered wrong livelihood, bad karma. The Buddha himself was strongly against animal sacrifice, which was common back then.
And what about plants and the environment in general?
Most Buddhist texts don't see plants as sentient beings, so using them for food and other things isn't seen as ethically wrong. But there's growing awareness of the environment's importance for everyone's well-being, including animals. Like protecting forests helps animals. And the core Buddhist principles, interdependence, loving kindness, compassion, they naturally lead to ecological awareness and wanting to live sustainably. When you see how interconnected everything is, you feel responsible for the whole ecosystem.
It's like a big picture ethics. Now, on to a difficult topic. War, violence, and punishment. What's the basic Buddhist view on these?
Buddhism is largely against war and violence. They're seen as causing huge suffering for everyone, creating hatred and more violence. The Dhammapada has verses that say all beings fear harm and death, and that's used to justify nonviolence. Unlike some other traditions, Buddhism doesn't believe in a just war that gets you rewards in heaven. They say that dying in battle usually leads to rebirth in the lower realms because of all the negative emotions.
The entry mentions Chandrakirti, a Mahayana philosopher,
Right.
as being especially critical of those who die in battle. It almost sounds pacifist.
Yeah, Chandrakirti really condemned people who seek glory or a better rebirth through war. He said it's all delusion clinging to a false self. And Buddhist monks are expected to be strictly nonviolent to the point of being killed rather than killing. Historically, they've often been peacemakers.
But the entry also says that Buddhism isn't always completely pacifist.
That's important to note. Nonviolence is hugely important, but some Buddhist traditions have found ways to justify using force in rare cases. Like the Manajana idea of compassion-motivated action could apply to things like stopping genocide. The ethical reason would be to protect the vulnerable and prevent the perpetrators from creating even more bad karma.
The analogies they use, the doctor amputating a limb to save the patient, the hunter killing one son to save the others, it's about causing less harm to prevent greater harm.
Exactly. And some scholars argue that the Pali word himsa is closer to harm than violence. So maybe actions that involve force are okay if they prevent much greater harm. Some Buddhist scriptures actually support defensive warfare, but only if it's done with restraint and compassion, with the goal of protecting yourself and others. And there are historical examples of Buddhist societies going to war for defensive reasons.
Okay, what about punishment in a legal system? How does Buddhism approach that?
Early Buddhist texts don't talk much about punishment, but later thinkers like Nagarjuna took a consequentialist view. In his Precious Garland, he argues that punishment, while unfortunate, is needed for social order to stop further harm. But it should be done with compassion, focused on rehabilitation and deterrence, not revenge. He said we should treat offenders humanely and release them early if they're not dangerous. A Sangha's framework, with compassion as the motivation, could also justify punishment as a way to keep dangerous people away from others, deter crime, and help criminals change their ways. This benefits society and the criminals themselves because it prevents bad karma. The focus is always on reducing suffering and promoting well-being, even in the context of punishment.
So Buddhism is generally against violence and war, but it recognizes that the world is complicated. In extreme cases, it might allow for actions that involve force, but only if they're motivated by compassion and aim to prevent greater harm and suffering for everyone. Now on to some sensitive issues, abortion and euthanasia. What are the main Buddhist ethical views on these?
In traditional Buddhist ethics, the majority view on abortion is pro-life. It's based on the belief that a new life, with the potential for awakening, starts at conception. So abortion is seen as a very serious act of taking a human life, with big karmic consequences.
But the entry acknowledges that technology and society have changed a lot since the early Buddhist teachings. How does that affect modern Buddhist views?
It definitely does. Things like severe fetal abnormalities or situations where the mother's life is at risk, those create ethical dilemmas that the early texts didn't directly address. While not harming is still central, some modern Buddhists are rethinking the traditional stance. Some question the idea that reincarnation happens right at conception. They point to scientific evidence that consciousness develops later. Others emphasize compassion for the mother and the potential harm of unwanted pregnancies. And it's important to remember that even if most Buddhists personally see abortion as wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean they want to outlaw it. They believe in religious tolerance and understand that restrictive laws can be complicated and harmful.
What about euthanasia and assisted suicide? How do those fit in, considering the emphasis on compassion and relieving suffering?
If someone who's healthy commits suicide, that's generally seen as negative in Buddhism because it's like rejecting the chance to practice and grow spiritually. But for people with terminal illnesses who are suffering terribly, it's more complex. The emphasis on the value of life and the rule against killing usually lead to a cautious stance on euthanasia and assisted suicide. But compassion and relieving suffering are also important. Traditionally, they believe that dying mindfully, peacefully preparing for the next life is very important. That might lead some people to prefer a natural death over medical interventions that don't really help. There are also concerns about the karma of doctors or family members who help someone end their life, especially if their motivation isn't pure compassion. It's one of those areas where different Buddhist values can clash, so there aren't easy answers.
Yeah, those are really tough issues. Okay, last one. AI and technology. That's changing so fast. How does Buddhist ethics approaching this?
It's a growing area of interest. One thing they're looking at is the attention economy, how technology grabs our attention and manipulates us. You could criticize this from a libertarian point of view, saying that our attention is a limited resource that's being unfairly exploited. But Buddhist ethics focuses on attention itself as a spiritual practice. Right attention, or mindfulness, is about being clear, not attached, and not distracted. That's crucial for being ethical and wise. So they criticize the attention economy because it cultivates wrong attention, distraction, craving, aversion. That undermines our ability to act ethically and see things clearly.
And what about things like surveillance capitalism? Losing our privacy in the digital age.
The Buddhist idea of emptiness challenges the Western idea of privacy as a right, or the idea that information belongs to a fixed self. Bryce Goodman, for example, says that the main problem with surveillance capitalism isn't violating our privacy, but that it distorts our perception of reality and makes the root causes of suffering, ignorance, craving, aversion, worse. Being constantly monitored and manipulated by algorithms reinforces the idea of a separate, vulnerable self. It makes our desires and fears stronger. So the ethical response is to cultivate wisdom and mindfulness in the face of these technologies. Buddhist ethics is still figuring out AI and technology, but the principles of not harming, compassion, and wisdom provide a framework for navigating these challenges.
So bringing it all together, what are the key philosophical takeaways from our Buddhist ethics deep dive?
I think for philosophers, what stands out is how complex and nuanced Buddhist ethics is. It's not just rules, it's a system connected to a whole worldview and a deep understanding of the mind, all aimed at ending suffering. The focus on intention, the differences between the different schools, the way they deal with modern ethical problems, it all shows a sophisticated and evolving tradition. And the way it balances personal transformation with caring for all beings is really interesting philosophically.
I hope this deep dive has helped you understand the core ideas and debates in Buddhist ethics. It's a complex tradition, but it offers a lot to think about for anyone interested in philosophy.
Absolutely. It gives us a new way to look at those big questions about good and bad, why we act ethically, and what the purpose of life is.
I think so too. Thinking about what we've discussed, about intention and interconnectedness, how might those Buddhist ideas change how you think about ethical responsibility in your own life and in the world? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry goes even deeper into all of this, so definitely check that out if you want to learn more. It's a way of thinking that's still relevant and constantly changing, offering insights into ethical living and the path towards a more compassionate and understanding world.